Okay. Good morning. I am happy to welcome you all to our program today, Palestinian Grassroots Protests and Violent Repression by the Palestinian Authority. I am Sarah Ann Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I am so happy to be joined today by three experts, Aseel AlBajeh from Al-Haq, Dr. Yara Hawari from Shabaka, and Mona Shtaya from Hamla. I'm going to begin with some housekeeping. The format for today's event will be a discussion between the panelists and me. It will go for about an hour and 15 minutes. It is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. Greetings to everyone who is joining us on Facebook. Hello. In addition to my own questions, I am eager to take the audience questions. Please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can do so anytime throughout this panel. I will be keeping an eye on the Q&A box and will do my best to weave as many of your questions as possible into the discussion. Please also keep an eye on the chat box. My colleagues at the Foundation for Middle East Peace will be putting useful links and information in that box throughout the discussion. Please do not use the chat box for questions because I will not see them. Finally, please note that we have enabled the closed captioning function for those who prefer or need to read rather than hear this discussion. Okay, our room is now full, and now that we are here, welcome everyone. I am very happy to welcome you to our program today, Palestinians, Grassroots Protests and Violent Repression by the Palestinian Authority, featuring Aseel AlBajeh from Al-Haq, Dr. Yara Hawari from Shabaka, and Mona Shtaya from Hamla. A week ago, about 2 weeks ago, Palestinian security forces arrested Nizar Banat, a political activist and well-known critic of the Palestinian Authority. Palestinians across, About 2 weeks ago, Palestinian security forces arrested Nizar Banat, a political activist and well-known critic of the Palestinian Authority. They beat him to death. Protests against the PA erupted following Banat's killing, and Palestinians across the West Bank continue to take to the streets to oppose the PA's brutality, despite facing violent repression at the hands of Palestinian Authority security forces. Women, especially human rights workers and journalists, are facing particular intimidation and harassment. Today, we will discuss questions including: who are the people going out to protest against the Palestinian Authority? What are their demands? What risks do they face in protest? Why has the PA responded to them so violently? What do these protests tell us about Palestinian grassroots organizing and leadership, especially in relation to the recent Palestinian uprisings in Jerusalem and inside the Green Line? And where might things go from here? How is this uprising against the PA part of a larger struggle against occupation, annexation, and apartheid? Thank you so much to our guests for joining us this morning. We are delighted to be joined by Aseel AlBajeh. Aseel is a legal researcher and advocacy officer at Al-Haq, Palestinian human rights organization. She was awarded the Ireland Palestine Scholarship Program to study at the Irish Centre for Human Rights at National University of Ireland, Galway, completing her LLM in International Human Rights Law in 2020. Dr. Yara Hawari, welcome. Dr. Hawari is the Senior Palestine Policy Fellow of Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She completed her PhD in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter, where she taught various undergraduate courses and continues to be an honorary research fellow. And Mona Shtaya, welcome, so glad you're here. A digital rights defender working in the Arab region, currently the local advocacy manager at Hamla, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. Aseel, Yara, and Mona are all based in the West Bank, where they live under both Israeli apartheid and occupation and the Palestinian Authority's repression. Thank you, each of you, for choosing to spend time with us and our audience today. Yara, let's start with you. The protests in the West Bank have been covered in major American media, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, and FMEP has been covering them extensively in our daily news roundup. But for our listening audience, let's start at the beginning. Why are Palestinians protesting against the Palestinian Authority right now? Who was Nizar Banat?
Sarah, thank you for asking that question. It's always important to start from the beginning. And as you mentioned, on the 24th of June, just about 2 weeks ago now, activist and outspoken critic of the Palestinian Authority, Nizar Banat, was arrested and beaten to death by the Palestinian Authority security services. Now, Nizar was a political activist who spoke loudly in critique of the Palestinian Authority and its increasing authoritarianism, but also specifically about the corruption and brutality of the security forces. And so many are actually dubbing this what happened as a political assassination. And since that day, Palestinians across the West Bank and beyond have hit the streets in protests in demand for justice for Banat and his family, but also others who've suffered at the hands of the PA security forces. But the chants have also escalated into a larger demand for the fall of the regime and for the end of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. And I need not remind you all that Abbas and PA institutions are a decade past their elected mandate. The PA's rule is increasingly done so through presidential decrees. There's mass corruption within the system. It's propped up by cronyism, nepotism, and deeply riddled misogyny. And now that situation has been getting progressively worse over the last decade. But these structures in place were built for the situation to be created, and we can discuss that a bit more later. But it's important to know that these protests across the West Bank, but particularly in Ramallah, have been met with extreme violence and repression at the hands of the security forces, have used so-called crowd control weaponry such as tear gas and stun grenades, and have actually carried out sweeping arrests of those taking part in the protests.
Thank you, Yara. Thank you for giving us that background and introduction and setting us up. I want to ask you, Mona, to tell us a little bit more, now that we understand why people are out in the streets protesting. Tell us more about the Palestinian Authority's response. Who are the forces responding to the protests with this extreme violence?
Thanks, Sarah, for this question. Actually, the Palestinian Authority brutally suppressed the protesters in the streets. We saw Palestinian security forces in their official uniform, alongside with plainclothes police officers and civilians who are affiliated to the PA, contributing to the brutal suppression of these protesters. It seems that the PA has a fear of the exposure of its human rights violations against protesters and journalists. So they have broken journalists' cameras and confiscated and stole the protesters' mobile phones to avoid any documentation of its human rights violations and suppression for such peaceful protests. They were targeting journalists, human rights activists, and some workers in human rights organizations. I believe Aseel will talk much more about this section, and other protesters who were chanting justice for Nizar and asking for democratic renewal. As we Palestinians had not the chance to choose our representatives since 2006. And even when they decided to hold these elections, as you may hear, they put many restrictions to exclude women and to exclude young people from running for these elections. Almost, they were working to make it almost exclusively for the large parties who are controlling now the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And then we ended up postponing or quote unquote canceling these elections, which is really frustrating for people. And Nizar was asking just for, or was critique about the corruption and also about the political situation that we are living in.
Mona, thank you. Thank you for describing the violence in the street and the targeting, who is being targeted, but also tying this, the Palestinian Authority's response already to the elections and what the power structure looks like, who is invited, who is excluded. what that looks like. We're going to be getting into the question of the Palestinian Authority and more broadly. So thank you. I appreciate that. And Aseel, Mona mentioned that you have personal experience and also that human rights advocates have been directly targeted, human rights advocates and women journalists. Will you tell us your experience, please?
Thank you. Yeah, so as Yara and Mona said, the protests that have erupted since 2 weeks were all met with violence and repression by PA security forces, ranging from the use of tear gas and stun grenades against protesters and dragging protesters on the streets of Ramallah, beating journalists with sticks, confiscating the equipment to document these violations happening in these protests. But from my personal experience, the worst protest was on the 27th of June. And this is in particular because there was a call for a protest to against the killing of Nizar Banat, and at the same time a counter protest was called for by PA or Fatah loyalists at the same time or an hour earlier to that protest. So what happened is that the protest at that day started at 6, I remember, and 10 minutes or less even, we were chanting, protesters were chanting. I was there in my Al-Haq uniform or vest to document the violations against the protesters and to film and monitor the situation. 10 minutes after the chanting by the protesters, the Fatah loyalists were approaching the protester and trying to make people leave the street. And as soon as the protester refused to leave, the violence began. And this was very rapid. The first thing I was trying to document was a person being dragged on the ground and being beaten on his head by a group of PE security forces. Now, noting that all these Fatah loyalists and security forces were in civilian clothing, and the police was on the top of the street watching. So this is the scene that was there. I was trying to document this particular case, and one man approached me very violently, and he kind of took the phone away from me, and it was was the first time he tried to take my phone from me. Now the level of violence increased very rapidly, and people started going backwards to avoid being beaten because they were the level of violence, and they were holding these like sticks, and you can see in their eyes that they are willing to spill blood in the street. Now, what I continue to do is I try to document as much as I can the cases I was seeing, ranging from seeing journalists having their equipment confiscated from them. I saw one journalist on the ground and a group of men surrounding him, beating him on his helmet. I've seen some men holding a kind of gas tank, and this is a kind of intention to kill if he was left to do it. I've seen horrible scenes, including they were trying to cram people into buildings. So I had a friend inside this building, and a group of men raided the building, and they denied anyone to enter the building, and as they were trying to find someone or attacking a person in specific. Now, the shouting I heard from this building was horrific, specifically from women. I saw one man coming from this building with blood coming out of his on his face. The moment I saw some people coming out of, and when I talked to protesters after the protest, what happened inside this building is horrific. It included also sexual harassment against women inside this building. Now, just to conclude on what happened with me is that they were trying to confiscate any kind of camera or any person, including on journalists. And they didn't care if you're a journalist or if you are a worker in a human rights organization. Any attempt to document what was going on was an intimidation for them. So I was attacked twice after the first time, and the third time they managed to take my phone, and the group of men that surrounded me had the intention also to beat if I resisted the fact that they wanted to take my phone. And I was shielded by a group of protesters who were beaten also after protecting me. So this is the context of what happened on the 27th. It was scary, to be honest, specifically that you are standing in the street and you don't know if you will be beaten by a person because everyone is in civilian clothes, and noting that these people who were attacking the protests are our neighbors and friends and family. So there's also this kind of pain when you are being attacked by your Palestinian brother and sister.
Thank you so much, Aseel. So this is June 27th. What has happened since then? What has your interaction been with the authorities since then?
I would say there's a kind of fear and there's no safety, not just on personally speaking, but there's been, as Yara said, mass arrests against the protesters. And even when people were trying to, one protester was detained following that protest, and his wife was sitting in front of the police station, calling for the release of her husband and with her children, and saying no to political arrest. Now, the response to that was more brutality and more repression. The police forces attacked all the people who were standing in front of the police, including families and elderly people and women and lawyers and human rights defenders. And the level of violence at that day was also horrific. So there's this kind of fear whereby you know that if you are voicing your demands, you will be met with repression, and the level of violence reached the point where they don't care if there's blood spilled on the streets. And actually there's a kind of discourse going on from people trying to deviate the issue from being from the issue of people protesting against corruption and against the PA as a subcontractor, the Israeli colonization, and the PA as not being representative of the Palestinian people, and the repression of the PA forces, security forces, to these demands, turning the issue into a discourse of this will turn into a civil war if the protest will continue. And this is very dangerous, because if blood is spilled on the street, this is the sole responsibility of the PA. This is the response, the violent response. If this happens, it doesn't mean that we are talking about civil war, because we need not to deviate from the main issue, which is we want to restructure the whole representation of the Palestinian people in order to confront the Israeli colonization.
Thank you, Aseel. We are going to do a deeper dive into the connections between what's happening with the PA and the role of Israeli colonization and the relationships between. But before we get there, I just want to understand and to clarify. So there were at the protests, you have referenced I think each of you have referenced that security forces were not wearing uniforms. And the people who attacked protests there was a mix, some in uniform, but it sounds like mostly not. Who were they, and how did you know that they were from the Palestinian Authority? Aseel, would you?
Yes, so the suppression of the protest this time is not the first time the PA is suppressing peaceful protests. Palestinians have demanded their right in several instances. For example, a couple of years ago, when the PA was sanctioning the Gaza Strip, people went on protest as well, and this was met also by brutal repression. So the security forces that we are dealing with are kind of familiar faces because of the suppression they do in various throughout the history of the Palestinian Authority. And even in these late protests, in one day you will see a security officer in his uniform. The next day you will see the same person in civilian clothes. So this is how we kind of identify who are these security forces. But there are as well many Fatah loyalists as well in these protests, specifically the one on the 27th. They are our colleagues, they are our friends, and the level of violence was maintained by the loyalists as well as security forces at that day.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying and for also illustrating how intimate this violence sounds, that you know these people, that you recognize them. Thank you. So on that front of this kind of very targeted, very deliberate violence and targeting, Yara, I want to ask you about the specific targeting of women and of women human rights defenders at these protests. Will you help us understand the gendered violence and also help us understand the effect that this targeting is having on Palestinian women?
Yeah, and I think, demonstrations and protests have long been sites of gendered violence, not just in Palestine, but all over the world. But in the last few weeks in the West Bank, we have, well, at least I think that we have seen an increase in the targeting of female protesters and activists. For example, I heard some security forces in plain clothing say that they wanted to get their hands on some women so that they could rough them up. And so we've seen that repeatedly over the demonstrations over the last few weeks. And, in addition to using sort of sexist insults and insinuations that are usually amount to verbal sexual harassment, security forces in uniform and in civilian clothing have also physically sexually harassed women or sexually assaulted women. And this kind of harassment or assault in such spaces really aims to punish and deter women from taking part in political activism. But it also has another effect. It encourages male activists or demonstrators to also deter female participation because they fear for the safety of their female comrades, and so their immediate response is to suggest that they shouldn't be on the streets. And there are a lot of other gendered practices that are used outside of protests as well. Secret services have been known to call women and girls' families to discuss their activism and even threaten them. Online, we've seen a lot of targeting of and harassment of women activists. People uploading pictures of these activist women, targeting them, but also sometimes even uploading pictures of random women who in their eyes are, scandalously dressed and have claimed that, that those women are activists when in fact they're not. They've just found their pictures online. And so that the general narrative that's adopted by the Palestinian Authority and many Fatah loyalists is that the women and activists in the streets are women with loose morals. These women are coming with foreign agendas. All kinds of specific words are used to kind of denote certain things about these women. And this comes, this is not something that's new. Since the very beginning, misogyny has really been a modus operandi for the Palestinian security forces and the larger Palestinian political establishment. And ironically, the internationally funded projects which, aim to include more women in the security sector have actually only entrenched the misogyny and gendered violence, you know, by pushing more women into the police, into the secret services, into the security forces. International donors have actually helped to expand on the sector's capabilities in targeting female activists. We fear, you know, the female police officers when they come out, or the female security officers when they come out, because they are the ones that will, you know, will grab us and will arrest us, and will do so without any qualms. So, you know, this is something that is deeply entrenched, and it has a really disturbing effect on Palestinian women. When we, as Palestinian women activists, when we go to the streets, you know, we know full well that our bodies might be weaponized against us. So not only do we have to prepare ourselves for demonstrating against a body that is supposed to be representative and is supposed to be serving our liberation, we also have to go ready, for knowing full well that our bodies might be assaulted, and that, you know, that, and it's incredibly challenging to be facing that on two fronts, and it's very disturbing. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, has that very unfortunate effect on our male comrades as well, who internalize a lot of the misogyny and misogynistic practices that are happening as well.
Thank you, Yara. And of course, the accusation that feminism is a foreign agenda, is part of a foreign agenda, is also very, very old. This idea of women standing up for their rights as something that certainly couldn't be indigenous to Palestinians. So, Mona, I want to ask you to please add to the picture that Yara and Aseel have been painting, and specifically also about the digital tools that the PA has used to harass and to target women. Is this new, or have you seen this tactic before?
Thanks, Sarah. So, as we previously mentioned, Yara, Aseel, and I, after the PA forces suppressed the protest, stole and confiscated the mobile phones of the protesters, and more focused on the protesting women, as Yara said and explained, we monitored a number of accounts on social media platforms who were publishing a very private pictures for these ladies as a tool to threatening them, intimidating them, and as an attempt to prevent them from taking the streets again and again. And by doing so, they know well that we are living in a very patriarchal and conservative community, and women have been largely targeted in these attacks. In 2017, I would like to highlight the cybercrime law, which basically the Palestinian Authority were talking about it as a tool to protect women and children in the online space. This is like a very bad, it's a nightmare law that the PA have launched in 2017. And we had like a very huge campaign as a Palestinian civil society to amend this law. And with the long advocacy work, we were able to amend it after 1 year, like in 2018, we have a second version. It was also bad. They are still using it against protesters, against activists, and against human rights defenders, just when they are opponent to the government and when they are critique about the government, and especially the PA. The main issue with this law, or the main pretext that the PA were arguing about this law is protecting the women and children. By doing what they did, they were putting our lives at risk. They know that in this conservative communities, and they were specifically targeting the women who were from a very conservative background, they know that they may intimidate them and they put their lives at risk. And sometimes it may reach like to honor killing, or what's called honor killing, and many other issues. And such behavior would for sure put our lives at risk. And we have also heard from activists and human rights defenders about their prosecution and pressure, how the PA was putting pressure on their families, not only female activists, but also our male colleagues. They were facing like a pressure on their families to prevent their sons and daughters from going out to the streets. And this is like using a very patriarchal tools to put pressure on your sons and daughters from going out to the streets and from being a critique about the system and this regime. And the main objective of what the authority is doing is the social ostracism of women, and therefore such a thing is horrifying and dangerous and threatens the society's safety, which usually the PA is claiming and taking it like a cover to make all of their laws, which is really frustrating for activists and for human rights defenders. All their laws and all their practices that they did with the tech tools and with the digital tools are really violates the minimum standards that respect the freedom of opinion and expression and the right to privacy and data protection, all of which are problems that we are already facing with the current and existing laws that we have in the Palestinian authorities. If this is like a new trend or it was used from before, I believe it's not a new trend. And I think it was used from before, but not from only the PA, but from the settler colonialism regime, who were usually taking such tools to prevent us from struggling for our rights and for our going out to the streets to be critique about their apartheid practices and policies. So this is not new, and we have seen this from before, but this is maybe the first time that we see the PA using it in such let's say intense way. So yeah, this is like what the tech tools look like, or the tech ways that they use to suppress Palestinian voices, and especially the Palestinian women.
Thank you, Mona. So a follow-up question. Yara described for us that this impact on women and also on their male colleagues, and a kind of it sounds as if the attempts to deter the protesters may actually be working, and yet here we are having this conversation. The three of you are having this conversation very openly. You have all been very public about the targeting of women and human rights defenders and the use of digital tools. Aseel, you told your story on Twitter. You documented what happened. You have all documented. So I want to ask, what has been the response to people coming forward with their stories of being targeted? How has Palestinian society, media, other parts of Palestinian society responded to the raising up of these stories of repression and harassment? Mona, can we start with you for that answer?
Yeah, sure. So it's a bit hard to make a generalization in such case, because some people are really taking this as a challenge and they want to be much more vocal to prevent the PA from continuation to suppress us in the streets and from preventing us from our freedom of expression and to be critique about their corruption. And because we, as a young generation, we know like we have never been like in, let's say, living under a normal, quote unquote, authority that should at least speak and support us in our struggle and to confront the Israeli settler colonialism practices and policies. We are facing like two regimes or two authorities, the PA and also the Israeli, which is like the PA is a subcontractor, as Aseel previously mentioned. And because of that, some people are taking this as a challenge and they want to challenge much more and more. But on the other hand, there is such kind of fear and people are really scared to continue on this work, specifically with what's happening from arresting high-profile people and so on. So this is like a very big debate, and we can like never expect what people are deciding to do. I believe like still the PA, the Palestinian civil society is still taking the lead, and we have like a clear position from human rights organizations to confront what the PA suppression and how the PA suppression is being used. But still, this is like not enough. We need like to amplify and to work more and more, and to create like such a safe space for women also to be in the streets and in protest, because what they aiming to do is to take us away from the streets and from the political arena. And this is like what they are doing from decades ago, and they are by doing so, by harassing us, by intimidating us, they are like escalating, and they are creating like a fear atmosphere that prevent women or discourage women from continue in the political way and from the human rights work. So this is like a very big discussion, and I believe like a young generation, we should continue in what we started over the past months, let's say, because it started with the Israeli authorities, and now we are continue with the Palestinian Authority. So this is like what I think about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Aseel or Yara, do you want to respond on this question of Aseel, I would love to start with you actually, because you told your story of having been harassed. You have been telling it publicly. Do you want to respond to this question of how you've been received as you've told your story?
Yeah, I guess there are many levels of the response. On the one hand, you fear that there is more repression by the Palestinian Authority. On the other hand, as a woman, also you have this double pressure from the people you are surrounded by, who love you, your family, who are also afraid that your participation will cost you. But the way I see it, to be honest, is that the reality we are living in is even more painful than the pressure we are subjected to if we voice our demands. So the reality being being under colonization and also repression by supposed Palestinian leadership, whereby your dignity is not maintained, right? And there's no future for liberation and dignity with this reality. So you continue your activism and struggle, knowing that it will cost a lot. But the way as personally speaking, I see it more painful to stay silent.
Thank you, Aseel. Thank you so much. Yara, is there anything you want to add to this question?
Yeah, perhaps just to say that, the reaction from other Palestinians has been, in other areas, has also been equally important. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, for example, have also, come out to demonstrations. Notably, many of the women beaten up and dragged by the security forces are actually from Jerusalem and have also been at the protests in Sheikh Jarrah. And so, we cannot forget, of course, what has been happening over the last few months, which has been a unifying moment for the Palestinian people. And we're seeing this continue to today in the protest against the Palestinian Authority. And I think it says a lot about how Palestinians understand the Palestinian Authority as part and parcel of the oppressive Israeli regime, and that the two can no longer be separated or could never be separated, and it's not acceptable anymore to excuse them. Unfortunately, from the Palestinian political institutions themselves, we haven't, as one might expect in other contexts, we haven't seen mass resignations or statements of support for activists, which I think just goes to show how deeply embedded this kind of culture of political repression is in the Palestinian political institutions.
Thank you, Yara. That's an important point to make. Have you seen any defections from Fatah or from any Palestinian political figures?
Yes, Abbas resigned on the spot.
Okay, back to this planet. Just as you were just saying, Yara, we can't have this discussion about how the PA has been violently repressing protests without discussing the Israeli government and military, which hold the ultimate authority in the West Bank and with which the PA are closely coordinating in enforcing the occupation and quelling protests. And I want to ask each of you to comment on this. Yara, let's start with you. Will you talk to us about the PA's relationship to and coordination with Israel? What does it look like? And I want to ask you overall, I have a broad question about how the current protests against the PA illuminate the work of the PA in supporting Israeli domination. But go back for us a moment. Nizar Banat was arrested in H2. Tell us about this security coordination, please.
Yeah, and perhaps firstly, before I answer that, I think it's important to contextualize the Palestinian Authority and its security forces. That, the Palestinian Authority was created out of the Oslo Accords as this interim body until Palestinian statehood would be achieved. And the security forces are a key pillar of that regime. It exists under this framework of a securitized peace. So in other words, it must work in full cooperation with the Israeli regime. And donors, international donors and third state actors alike see the Palestinian security sector as vitally important for maintaining the status quo. And since its creation in the 90s, it's grown exponentially. The Palestinian security sector is responsible for the employment of nearly half of all civil servants. And it enjoys a budget that's larger than the education, health, agricultural sectors combined. So the security cooperation between the Israeli regime and the Palestinian security forces, what that includes is, handing over information, whereabouts of Palestinian activists to the Israeli army, such as what happened with Asseel AlBajeh, a Palestinian activist who was assassinated by Israeli forces after his whereabouts were divulged to them by the Palestinian Authority. It also includes joint meetings and workshops, which result in similar techniques of oppression used against Palestinians across colonized Palestine. It also means that, it facilitates the entry of the Israeli army into areas A, and in this case with Nizar Banat in H2, which is under direct Israeli military control, the Palestinian security forces would have had to have communicated to the Israeli army that they are going in. They would have had to have had permission to go and do what they did to Nizar Banat. And this is not a one-off. This is a systematized process that happens every single day. Now, all of this is funded and trained by international donors, including the US, the EU, UK, Canada. The Palestinian security sector serves to maintain Palestinian compliance and subdue Palestinian resistance to the status quo. And if we consider that the largest threat to Palestinian security is the Israeli regime and military occupation, which in turn directly impacts education, health, general well-being of Palestinians, to focus the majority of the money coming into Palestine on the security sector that is not built to maintain Palestinian security, but rather to guarantee Israeli security, is completely absurd. But this is the situation that we have. It is a direct outcome of Oslo, and it's built in mind to keep Israel secure from the people that it oppresses and occupies.
Thank you for that very authoritative explanation and for laying out these relationships for us. Mona, I want to ask you, can you talk to us about how the protests against the PA relate to the larger struggle of living under Israeli occupation?
Yes, sure. So I'll start talking that, or I start mentioning that we have not, or we did not hear the voice of the PA during all kinds of aggressions or attacks that we witnessed in May from the Israeli forces against Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, in Jerusalem, in Gaza Strip, in West Bank, and also against Palestinian citizens of Israel. They were silent. We did not hear any kind of thing from the PA. And either we did not hear anything from them about the de facto annexation that's happening in the West Bank nowadays, in Beta and many other villages and cities. So therefore, we say, of course, that the protesters taking to the streets against the oppression of the authorities, despite its PA authority or the Israeli authorities. And it's very linked because the Palestinian Authority is like a subcontractor of the Israeli authorities, and they are like working in harmony with each other and in a tight and close coordination between each other. They are working, and they are also using the same tactics and tools to suppress people, either from the Israeli settler colonialism regime or from the Palestinian Authority. We have also heard over the past 2 weeks about the Palestinian Authority and their announcement to request to purchase equipment and tools to suppress demonstrations from the Israeli authorities or from Israel, which in one way or another will include spy and surveillance technologies from the Israeli authorities, who are really pioneers in such suppression tools, as they are testing this on Palestinians before selling it worldwide. And not only spying and surveillance technologies, but other kinds of military tools and weapons that they are usually testing on Palestinians before selling it to the world. So they are using the same technologies, the same tactics, the same tools, even because it's like very close what's happening on May and what's happening in June. And now we can also clearly see how the Israeli authorities were attacking human rights defenders and also journalists who were documenting human rights violations that happening on the streets and that Palestinians are exposed to before sharing it on the social media, and how the PA are using such tools because both of them are afraid from the exposure of these human rights documentations. And because of that, they are using same tactics, same tools, and it's like the same policies. They are securitizing and militarizing everything in the digital space and also in the on the ground work, let's say, or activism. So the repressive tools that they are used to oppress Palestinians today are either from the PA or from the Israeli authorities are almost the same. Because of that, they are both linked together. And because of that, Palestinians won't accept any kind of suppression. Either it comes from the PA or it comes from the Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid regime. So it's like very connected thing. We can't separate them.
Thank you. Thank you. Aseel, this week, speaking of what Mona is talking about the connections, this week Israel arrested Farid al-Atrash, an attorney who had just participated in a protest against Nizar Banat's killing and was passing through an Israeli checkpoint. Al-Haq, your Al-Haq, said that, and now I'm quoting Al-Haq, the arrest of Farid illustrates Israel's attempts to discourage individuals and organizations from documenting and highlighting consistent violations of international human rights and humanitarian law in the occupied Palestinian territory. The urgent appeal further underscored the need to address Farid's arbitrary detention within the broader context of Israel's systematic policy of silencing of opposition to maintain its apartheid regime over the Palestinian people as a whole. Will you talk to us about Israel's arrest of Farid and other Palestinian activists and how this struggle against the PA relates broadly to the struggle against Israeli colonization?
Of course. So I think Yara touched on security coordination or talked about security coordination. Here it's important to mention that Farid was a human rights defender working at the Independent Commission for Human Rights. And this is a national human rights organization, actually. And he was a critic of the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli authorities as well. And his arrest came from the Israeli side, but after his protest against the killing of Nizar Banat. And it can be read a scenario to see it as a kind of coordinated between the two parties to silence and deter Palestinian activism. And as you said, the crime of apartheid. One element of the crime of apartheid is having the apartheid regime and having an intention to maintain the apartheid regime. And this is very much exemplified in Israel's systematic and ongoing, historical and ongoing policy to repress any kind of opposition or resistance by Palestinians. So be it the arrests or torture or the targeting of civil society organizations and human rights defenders, or the collective punishment of the Palestinian people under the guise of security. Of course, it's absurd as such as like collectively punishing 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip under the guise of security. So all these measures that Israel does in the name of security is just a form of a way to, first of all, weaken the will of the Palestinian people to challenge its apartheid and settler colonial regime. And it's also a tool by which it maintains its apartheid regime. Now, how is this related? How the PA's, the Palestinian struggle against the PA is related to the struggle? It's very much the Israeli struggle. It's very much the same because, as Yara said, the PA is actually an interim body that was supposed to be there for 5 years and until final negotiations take place for fundamental issues for the Palestinian people, including, for example, the issue of refugees. So the PA is now has been acting with full corruption, continued to suppress Palestinian rights instead of the Israeli side sometimes as part of the security coordination. It has continued to maintain control over all authorities, including the executive and the judicial system, and also the legislative part of the authority. And it has done so while also not representing Palestinian people by neglecting these fundamental issues and the historical context of the Palestinian struggle, which when we talk about the refugees, it's the majority of the Palestinian people are refugees. So when we look at the PA, it's actually an impediment towards the Palestinian struggle towards liberation, because since the Oslo Accords and the creation of the PA, settlement expansion has continued. Actually, there's been an infrastructure created in parallel to this settlement enterprise, including the annexation wall and the permanent checkpoints that subjects the Palestinian to movement restrictions and denies the right to self-determination ultimately. There has been the continuation of the security coordination as well as controlling the Palestinian economy as well, with this the continuation of the Palestinian Authority. So the struggle is pretty much the same because the PA acts in its form now, acts as an impediment towards the struggle towards liberation against Israeli colonization.
Thank you. Thank you, Aseel. So what you have all described is quite scary and daunting. On a personal level, of course, you have talked about demonstrations and this double targeting, and the prospect of bodily harm is scary, no matter how much you can fortify yourself and develop activist discipline. It is terrifying. And the need to struggle against Israeli colonization and Palestinian leadership is also daunting. And you have described so effectively, so persuasively, how these leaderships are so intertwined, and the struggle is so interconnected. And I want to ask you what you are imagining for the next few months, and specifically because these last few months, and if you have spoken about, I think Mona spoke most about the protests in Jerusalem, and also Yara, you spoke about people from 48 coming out. The last few months have really seen a burst of energy among Palestinians for unity, for rights, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in diaspora, inside the Green Line, this notion of a new unity intifada. So I want to ask you, this is for each of you, what you're hoping for in the months ahead. But I want to add to that question of hope and ask you specifically what you might imagine about the PA in the months ahead. So what you're hoping for and what you're expecting with the PA in the months ahead. Mona, let's start with you.
Thanks, Sarah. So what we hope for is getting the Palestinian rights. I mean, we are struggling over the past decades for the Palestinian rights, for the self-determination, for the right of return, for all the Palestinian rights. I mean, to end this occupation and so on. So this is what we are aiming for. This is what we are hoping, and this is what we want. Because of that, we are struggling this complex situation that we are living in. We hope, like, also this political split and political division between the West Bank and Gaza Strip is soon to be ended, and to be like when Palestinians can and move freely between the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jerusalem, and also with the 48 lands. So this is like what we are aiming for, what we hope as Palestinians. We hope like everyone between the river and the sea can live in freedom, equality, and dignity. This is what we work for. This is what we believe in. But what we are expecting is a bit harder, because the reality that we are living in, the struggle that we are facing and confronting, either with the PA or with the Israeli government, is making it such complex. We are really scared as an activist, also as organizations, because of all the complex situation that they are putting in front of us, and with everything that they are using to suppress people, to suppress critique voices. This is like spreading the politics of fear, securitizing and militarizing everything, intimidating people, and creating this kind of life that you have only to think about your own issues, not as a collective issue for Palestinian freedom and the Palestinian people dignity and living in a free Palestine. So a bit the reality is a bit complex, but our hopes are really high, and we will continue what our grandfathers and grandmothers started from decades ago, to have to live like in a free Palestine, let's say.
Thank you. Yara, I want to ask you the same question, and I actually want to add to it. So it's, what are you hoping for? What are you expecting? But also a question of, in terms of what are you expecting from the PA, I want to also ask you how you think that Western human rights organizations should be relating to the PA. And let's start there.
Well, my hopes are very different from my expectations. My hopes in the next few months are very much for mobilization to continue, for us to remain steadfast amidst the violent repression, and for us to sort of develop into a larger and wider movement for Palestinian liberation that includes calls for the dismantlement of the Palestinian Authority. However, my expectations are, I think, a lot more stark than that. I think over the next few months, we'll see increased PA repression. I think we'll see a lot more arrests and coordinated arrests with the Israeli regime as well. I think this has shocked many in Palestinian civil society, but I think sometimes shocks are good and important, especially to burst that Ramallah bubble that many of us live in, exist in, and work in. And I think it was effective in doing that. So I hope that we remain steadfast. And if I know Palestinian people, and I do quite well, we will. As for Western organizations, human rights organizations, and solidarity organizations, I think it's important to place incredibly harsh restrictions on the Palestinian Authority. I know that many outside are fearful of getting involved in what they call Palestinian internal politics. But they have to understand, as Palestinians, many Palestinians do, that the Palestinian Authority functions as a subcontractor for the Israeli regime. We can no longer accept Palestinian Authority officials to speak on behalf of the Palestinian struggle. People should not be inviting Palestinian officials to speak on behalf of Palestinians. Personally, I think that these organizations should be cutting all ties where possible with such bodies, because this might be the only way in which we can apply that pressure. Moreover, I think that the international donor community needs to cut funding to the Palestinian Authority security forces. Of course, this won't happen. We know why it won't happen, because that mechanism is so important for maintaining the status quo and subduing Palestinians. But if international donors were really interested in human rights, they would cut that funding to the security forces.
Thank you, Yara. Thank you for that clarity. Aseel, a question for you. What are you hoping for in the months ahead, and what do you expect?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what has been said, because there's kind of contrast between what we hope for and what we expect. I do agree with Yara that we expect more repression, but I just have some kind of hope, because the context of the PA repression comes in light of after the massive suppression of the United Uprising that erupted in the past couple of months, and the repression of the Israeli regime of the protests has changed some things. And Yara, I think she wrote about that, about the fragmentation of the Palestinian people, and how the protests have been, because they have been led and have been voicing that the Palestinian people as a whole are subjected to this Israeli settler colonial regime wherever they are. So there's a kind of change in narrative, which is a positive thing, and it gives hope. And also the way I see it, that the more repression the PA in Israel is doing, it kind of give a signal that they are in a shaky position, because violence, the more violence they do, it just gives a signal that they are in a weak position. So and for hoping for what we're hoping for is that the Palestinian people continue to demand their right and mobilize and on the ground in Palestine and also on the international level.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Aseel, Yara, Mona, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone who joined us, who listened to this event. We are so glad to be able to share this conversation with you. Please check back at the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for a full list of resources relating to this conversation. Please check back for announcements of upcoming events, and join us on Tuesday for an event of a completely different flavor. It's called Make 'em Laugh, Comedy and the Fight for Palestinian Rights. And it is going to feature Maysoon Zayed, the actress, comedian, writer, and disability advocate, along with Noam Schuster, Jewish Israeli comedian, performer, peace builder, and activist. Thank you to Yara, Mona, and Aseel, and thank you to everyone who listened. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.